kind of weird. I got this like green glow on my hair. It's strange. But anyway, I'm an astronaut today. Here we go. We're going to rock and roll here. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to another Dolby Atmos 2024 seminar. I'm your host, Marc A. Gallo, along with Chip Powell, AES Chair of the Philadelphia chapter. Dolby Atmos 2024 features recording artists, producers, engineers, and industry experts who are deeply immersed in Dolby Atmos. Through these seminars and with your participation, we hope to elevate the craft of immersive productions. Tonight, we're featuring UK immersive engineer Richard Whittaker, plus our special guest, author and mixing engineer, Marcela Rada. But before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors for helping us make these seminars possible. First and foremost, the Audio Engineering Society, created by the industry for the industry. If you are not currently a member, I strongly encourage you to do so. Please visit aes.org to become a member today. Our next sponsor, Audeze, features the LCDX headphone, the audio professional's choice. Learn more at audeze.com. Also, our newest sponsor, Kali Audio, features the LP Series Immersive Speaker System. Visit kaliaudio.com for more information. And finally, Sonarworks, featuring their Sound ID reference software, which calibrates your speakers and headphones for better sonic accuracy. Find out more at sonarworks.com. Now on to our special guest, Marcela Rada. Marcela will present an overview of her research on spatial audio, which includes interviews with some of the leading immersive engineers in this industry. Hello, Marcela.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So tell us about your journey.
Wow, that's a long story, so I'll sum it up. Well, before I started my PhD, I'm currently doing a PhD at the University of Surrey. But before I started that, I was teaching full-time at the University of Lethbridge in Canada. And I decided to design a course around, spatial audio for immersive music production. And as I was designing that course, I realized that I needed more to make it really good. And I just wasn't feeling good about it. I needed to do a lot more research. And so this is the reason why I decided to take a break from teaching and do the research. So I started the PhD in September. So it's only been about 6-7 months. But my goal is to target 2 gaps that I've identified. Well, there are many, but there are 2 main gaps, I guess. And the first one is to target the gap in post-secondary audio programs regarding the lack of courses on spatial audio and its application to commercial music specifically. So through my research, what I'm doing is developing an educational tool that can be used by educators to design their own syllabi, courses, with a lot of guidelines and the things that through my research, I will find that are what need to be taught in these courses. Through this and through my research, I also want to merge, what we do in academia and what we do in the music industry. Although I am an educator and I have a very academic background, I am an audio engineer, I'm a recording and mixing engineer, and I am very active in the music industry as well. So I am in the middle of these 2 worlds, and I want to make sure that they merge because what? Oh,
It's okay. We're just
sorry,
audio engineers. We have glitches all the time.
Okay, I thought it was me.
Please have everyone mute.
Okay. I was saying that what I would like to do is kind of merge those 2 worlds. So when students are studying this kind of courses, they do get real world insights. That's one thing that I'm noticing, that there is a big gap there, and not
And
just
I
that.
just want to interject on that. I'm in the Philadelphia area here, and many of the music recording schools, but yeah, pretty much all of them, but for one, which I think is Drexel University, they don't teach Dolby Atmos or immersive audio at all. I mean, there might be in the film school, they're teaching surround sound 5.1, but even them aren't doing Atmos or anything like that. But continue. I just wanted to share that with you.
No, definitely it's a slow
Yeah.
process, and no judgment to anybody. It's a slow process. I know how universities work, and it takes a while to get through, designing a course, getting everything ready, getting budget for it. So it is a process. But I know that a lot of my colleagues at different universities around the world are working towards developing these courses and getting them ready. I know that is something that takes time, but this is why I wanted to start this now. So when the schools are ready, I also have this tool that the educators can use to then develop their programs. So the way that I am doing this methodology pretty much is to get insight from all the professionals, not all, but a lot of the professionals that are, actively working on Dolby Atmos mixes and other immersive platforms, and really understand what's going on. So I'm currently finishing up interviews, and I've talked to mixing engineers, musicians, composers, producers, people from streaming platforms, record labels. I'm trying to target a lot of different areas of the music industry to get all those insights. And I'm looking into, from how people want to learn, and all the different ways in which they would want to get this information, or could, to understanding the limitations and the challenges that are still present, and if some of them, I want to understand how they're overcoming those, to then be able to target the other gap that I wanted to mention, which is, we don't have a standardized process for producing music in immersive environments. And I'm talking about commercial music specifically, for recording, for the way that we stream, etc. There's so many gaps in that process that we're trying to get through, and it's totally normal that this process is developing, just like from when we went from mono to stereo. It's kind of happening kind of the same way now, different challenges, but it's a challenge, is a learning process. And so as we go through that, I want to make sure that I can also, through this research, have some recommendations for the music industry that will hopefully influence the way in which all of us work together. At the end of the day, I think this should be a collaboration, and this is one of the aspects that I want to write about, and is that the creative process shouldn't only fall on the mixing engineer. The artists need to be knowledgeable and perhaps have a different kind of knowledge, but the musicians, the artists, the record labels, everybody needs to have a certain type of knowledge to be able to work together, and that is also one of my goals, to influence the music industry this way. So we all have the kind of understanding and knowledge that we need. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody needs to go back to school. I want my educational tool to also be useful for those who have been in the industry for years and understand mixing well, and simply just want to jump into creating Dolby Atmos mixes and whatever else will come in the future. So that's a brief of what I'm trying to
A
develop.
couple of questions here that I wanted to ask you, and Richard, you can feel free if you want to chime in too, if you like. But the one question I want to ask, I know that you were saying that, and when you and I chatted before weeks ago, that you wanted to interview, immersive engineers that are doing it often. Are you trying to get from them techniques that you want to incorporate in these, for lack of a better word, these courses on mixing in Dolby Atmos, or whatever immersive technology and techniques known, proven, so to speak, to work effectively in an immersive sonic environment. Do you want to make that an integral part of the courses? Or, and what I'm leading to is that, look, you know, there's audio mixing courses out there that teach fundamentals where you always got to learn fundamentals, like this is a bed, this is an object, you know, talking about Atmos. This is a parametric EQ. This is a graphic EQ. Is it going to be that fundamental? Or is it going to be more, you know, techniques, philosophy, and mixing and so on, or both?
Yes. So what I'm trying to understand at the moment with the data that I'm gathering is their workflows, right? And how they've been developing throughout the years, what is working for them, what is not working for them, and if they face challenges, how they're able to fix it. So yes, I am asking questions about their mixing techniques, for example, and the things that they do consider that work and they use them constantly, and perhaps they're part of their template, etc. I do know that there's a lot of information out there on how to use Dolby Atmos. If you really want to learn how to use Dolby Atmos, easy, just Google it. You know, it's there. The information is there. Dolby Atmos has a great educational platform, and you could just go there and learn how to use the tool. Now, these mixing techniques and all these things that we're finding out, there's a lot of trial and error, and a lot of these engineers have been developing those techniques with experience and with, you know, mixing different records. So as we all kind of have gone through this process of learning on our own, I think to speed up the process of making this information accessible, that this information needs to be gathered and shared with everybody. And so yes, to answer your question, I definitely want to touch on these techniques that I can draw patterns from, that, you know, techniques that work throughout, you know, a group of people and that have been, you know, mixing successful records. So I definitely want to touch on the things that are not as accessible out there, and this mixing techniques that have definitely taken people time to develop. And so if everybody's kind of going through that process of trial and error, we're going to continue to have music that perhaps is not sounding so great. And so what I would like to help with is to, you know, speed up the process of people going through that trial and error and learning.
Sure. Obviously, that's what education does. It kind of helps you be a little bit more efficient. You know what I mean?
Exactly. So it's time for us to do that for this specific type of, you know, format. And yes, that is definitely one of the things that I want to target.
The other question that I had is, last seminar we had Ben Givers from Dolby, who did like a kind of your segment here, brief presentation more or less on the Dolby ecosystem, record labels, distribution channels, Tidal, Apple Music, and all that. Is your research getting into that, or is that no? It's like, really, look, it's just about immersive production.
No, it is getting into that. It's getting into the music industry as a whole, because this is information that we all need to know. That's the thing, that there's a lot of information that's not being shared, that is kind of hidden. If you're not in this small circle, you don't get it.
Yeah.
And we're never going to get anywhere if we're not all informed, if we all know what's happening to the music when it goes through the render, if it's going to change, we need to know. Things like that. I definitely want to write about this so people become more aware of the things that they need to question. Students need to question things, and that's part of going to school and learning, questioning, and it's not just about learning the tools, but questioning what the tools are, how the tools are working, and how they need to, and you know, and what they do to the music, and why we use them, and why it's happening this way. And so yeah, definitely want to focus on the why things are working out in the music industry at the moment, and I am getting that kind of information. Yes.
It's great. So do you have a date that you're shooting for? End of the year, end of next year?
A PhD takes about a minimum 3.5 years.
So it takes a while, yeah.
I definitely plan to publish papers, of course, throughout this time. So every year I will hopefully publish at least one paper where I will talk about my findings and the things that I, for sure can talk about, backed up by my research. So I will continue to talk about it, publish about it. I am, very active on social media and all this, a lot of different music industry and educational groups. So I plan to share my findings all throughout, but my actual thesis won't probably come out for another 3 years.
It's a project. I have several friends that have done dissertations, and I'm like, oh my God, like this thick.
Yeah,
I'm like,
it's pretty
yikes,
crazy.
I think I got second thoughts.
It was funny.
Yeah, it's pretty
But
crazy.
anyway, Richard, I just wanted to point out to you that she mentioned, you just touched on it, Marcela, using templates. Richard, do you from time to time when you're doing Atmos work, you use pre-formatted templates to kind of get things where you want it pretty quickly?
Yes, I do have an Atmos template which has all my outputs already set up, and a few of my
Shut up, man.
a few of my sort of initial setup things I use within the beds and things, just to save a bit of time, really, so I'm not setting it from scratch every single time. It's just a time-saving method, really, rather than as opposed to a cookie cutter approach, really.
Yeah, no, I use templates from time to time if it's a production that was similar to other productions I've done, but sometimes I find myself even building something from scratch.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me.
Sorry.
Have fun for the rest.
Again, it was great. All right. Now we're going to go over some ground rules, and I think I got to add some more ground rules to this. We hold a Q&A discussion after Richard Whittaker's presentation. All questions should be entered in the chat room where they'll be monitored. Hopefully, we'll be able to get to them all. Please keep your questions about or related to Dolby Atmos. Thank you. Tonight's featured speaker, Richard Whittaker, will be streaming live from across the pond in his studio, Starboard Audio. Richard is widely regarded as the go-to engineer for many heritage artists, producers, and record labels. He has produced immersive mixes for Thin Lizzy, Def Leppard, Traffic, The Kinks, Kiss, and The Who. During the seminar, we'll delve deep into his Atmos approach for The Who's seminal double album, Quadrophenia, including their hit, Love Reign Over Me. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Richard Whittaker.
Can you hear me, by the way? London calling.
Yeah. London calls.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me on here. The previous episodes have been absolutely fantastic. I loved every one of the information in there was just absolutely priceless. And it's great to see and hear other engineers and how they work in a similar way to me, but also in a very dissimilar way to me. It's so interesting, the different approaches. But anyway, cracking on for what I do. I've been involved in music all my life, pretty much. And I was first introduced to surround sound at university in 1997, where I studied music technology at York, which is in the north of England. Now, York University is one of the sort of forerunners of immersive and surround sound technologies, and we were a big part of the course was based around Ambionics. So at the time I was not very interested in Ambionics or the mixing for surround at all. I was more interested in tape recording, actually, in recording to analog multitrack tape. But so I was introduced to it there, and I got really into it, and we were making compositions that involve live performance and surround sound in the same space, which was quite interesting. But then once I'd completed that degree, I decided to move to London to do my master's and started working in various studios around London to help pay the bills. So I was essentially doing my master's through the day and working in studios through the night, which is pretty difficult to do, really. If you kind of need that thing called sleep, really. And so inevitably, I made the decision to carry on working in the studios because, you know, inevitably that's what I wanted to do, and it made no sense to stop how far I got with that just to complete the master's degree. So I chipped off and went into full-time studio work, which is what I've been doing ever since. Working around various studios, doing various types of mixing and restoration, recording, you name it, I've pretty much done it. But it was in the mid 2000s where I bumped into a chap called Bob Pridden. I don't know if you've come across Bob, who's he's a legendary guy. He kind of took me under his wing and he taught me so much. I mean, he's, you know, just read up on him on Wikipedia. The guy's an absolute legend. And that's when my journey with the Who began. So he started working on Who tracks, and the first project I worked with him was a stereo project, Live at Hull, where we had to rebuild the bass part for the first 6 songs, which were essentially missing from the recording. So that me and a team of engineers rebuilt that.
So was it a multi-track or just a 2-track?
It was a 1-inch 8-track recording.
Okay, and the bass was completely missing.
Yeah, yeah. So essentially, what it was, the famous recording, Live at Leeds.
Yeah, I love it.
Was actually the dress rehearsal for Live at Hull, and they were going to release. There was no intention of releasing Hull, and they then found out that the bass was missing the first 6 tracks, so decided to ditch it and use Leeds instead. So we were tasked. The first project with Bob was I was tasked to rebuild the bass. Me and a couple of other engineers, we rebuilt the bass, thousands upon thousands of edits, and then remixed the whole concert. It came out in the end pretty well. But from there, we then moved on to doing Tommy in 5.1, which is a very interesting project indeed.
What year, ballpark? What year was it? Still mid 2000s?
Yeah, about 2006, 2005, 2006, maybe. I think it was Tommy that came first, actually. But Bob and I did that. And interestingly, I don't know if any people out there have heard the 5.1 mix of Tommy that we did, but Bob came with this idea of putting the drums in the rear speaker. and me, but you know, I was like, okay, so we kind of went with it, and eventually your head kind of gets used to it, and it works, and it kind of goes along the lines of the old sort of 70s quad mixers, which is really cool.
That never lasted, but
techniques that I'll come on to this later, but I'm using a lot of those techniques now in what I'm doing. But so we did Tommy, and then we remixed Quadrophenia. Now at the time, these weren't match mixing as such. These were new mixes of these traditional albums in surround sound. So, you know, some things weren't. We were using not necessarily the correct technology. They were using sort of lexicons and things when we should have really been using plates. But you know, that it was a remix and it wasn't necessarily as stringent as it should have been. But going forward,
when you say, I just want to tap on that for a second. When you say it shouldn't have been as stringent, you took certain liberties, like, hey, it's a stereo mix. This is the stereo mix, but I'm in 5.1 now, so I'm just going to take certain liberties here and like really spread things out. Use some different reverbs and so on.
Yeah.
Is that what you're alluding to?
Yeah. It was kind of it didn't adhere so much to the original stereo, but then again, with the album Quadrophenia, there's so many different versions of it in stereo that which one do you actually go to reference to? So interestingly, the version of Quadrophenia that the vast majority of us all know is actually not the original version of Quadrophenia. It was a remix that was done in the 90s that everyone seems to know that version of. The original one that's mixed by Pete and Ron Nevison has kind of disappeared off into the ether somewhere. It's interestingly enough, when I was working on the Quadrophenia album with Bob, we were referencing the 90s remix, and a couple of tapes turned up which contained the original recording. I noticed there was sound effects and things that were on the original recording that weren't on the remix. So at that point I realized that this is a different mix. What is this? And I delved into it and realized that this is the original that not many people seem to be aware of. But
very cool.
yeah, so moving on to just a quick jump forward in time to when I recently did the version of Quadrophenia with Bob as well, because there are so many different versions of Quadrophenia, and we wanted to sort of encompass all of them and use, you know, so it felt, you know, it was true to the original, but it was also true to the remix, and it was true to every other version as close as we could get that was out there. So the workflow was a very complicated workflow because it's an incredibly complicated album to mix, and how they did it in the 70s on tape, I have absolutely no idea, because it is absolutely crazy
Well, there
complicated.
were no really any synchronizers back in the 70s, or primitive ones at that.
There's pilot tone, yeah, but I mean, I don't think there was much of that going on. But yeah, I mean, it's recorded on multiple formats. All the sound effects are on different tapes, yeah. But yeah, just initially trying to piece all this thing back together again, for going through all the tapes and finding all the sound effects. I mean, the amount of reels of Pete recording sea noises and for I Am the Sea was crazy. It's but yeah, it's very interesting to rebuild that. But that's what I kind of enjoy doing, is the forensic aspect of remixing these tracks and finding where these particular parts are, and how they're, and are they genuinely the right take, you know, because you'll get tapes with several different bass lines or vocal takes or whatever. You've got to figure out exactly precisely which one is the master and which is an outtake and which is not being used and which is being used.
So I assume it wasn't very well documented either.
There is certain amounts of documentation, as with all records. You know, you get the recall notes, you'll get bits and pieces knocking around, but some of it disappears over the test of time. Some of it's just not done at the time, you know. So it kind of.
But you got to figure it out yourself.
Yeah, you got a pair of ears, yeah.
Yeah. Basically, you got to figure it out yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds like a nightmare.
So yeah, going on for that, the whole forensic side of remixing an iconic album such as that is quite an interesting process, which I find incredibly interesting and sort of focus quite a lot on. So
and on that note, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna interject here, Richard, just for a second, because you touched on it when when you did the 5.1, you weren't entirely faithful to the original stereo mix, and you made a side comment where you sat there and said, well, we probably should have used plates. And like when you got into doing the Quadrophenia Atmos version, did you use kind of convoluted reverbs and stuff to try to have this similar, or did you take liberties there?
No, I mean, I essentially my forensic approach to mixing albums now is I initially start by researching the studio it was mixed in, if I can find that information, the equipment they used, the engineer and the producer at the time who was mixing the record, and what techniques they use on other records and how they build their sound.
Oh, wow.
So that's the start, the research to start with, and obviously getting yourself in that workflow as to how they did it at the time, and keep within that.
That's intense.
Yeah, so
yeah, that's intense, man.
That's the starting point, and then the next point is to actually phase align the multi-tracks to the reference stereo, so you've got everything precisely in the correct speed. So you're getting rid of any sort of mechanical drift or tonal differences that would occur. So once that's all edited and put into place against the stereo, you then find it's much easier to actually do the forensic parts to figure out which versions are being used and which aren't being used. A technique that I use is I generally have the reference mix on headphones in one ear, and I'll listen to every single part in my other ear, and I'll hear any slight difference, and I'll know immediately whether it's a correct part or not. I mean, because as long if it's phase aligned to if the multi-track's phase aligned to the stereo mix, then any difference will jump out immediately. So that in that way you can be absolutely sure that you're using precisely the correct parts that were used on the day to mix that, and not any dodgy edits or versions that shouldn't be used are jumping in there.
Yeah,
essentially. But yeah, as I say, but when I'm mixing these records, so from the initial get-go, I'm researching the workflow, the studio, how they did it, how they would have gone about it. Certain mixers and producers have very different techniques of the way they like to work and how they create their sound. Some are very straightforward, nuts and bolts. Others are very convoluted and difficult to understand how they get those sounds. And once you get your head around that, you know, you kind of start recognizing what they're doing and how.
Patterns.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, exactly.
I think one of the most difficult albums was to do this with was Low Spark of the High Heel Boys by Traffic, because it was literally the entire band stood around the mixing console, just all chipping into moving things around.
Yeah, that's the way it was really done back in the day.
So listening to those micro changes and differences, it's really quite something. But it makes the difference between a good mix and a bad mix, really, because it's keeping it true to the original.
I want to touch on something, just jumping back what you just touched on, your early education. If we can just digress for a second. Ambisonics.
Yeah.
Now, I read an article, and I'm a really poor note keeper, so I don't recall the source, but it was, you know, it was an audio engineering thing, and they were saying that we're talking about some scenarios where they've incorporated ambisonics, you know, into an Atmos mix. And I know before we started this seminar, you and I talked about it, that you didn't really have any experience of actually doing that. But just for the people out there and for myself, can you just touch on the fundamental differences between ambisonics and Atmos?
I mean, when I was involved with the ambisonics side of things, it was, we're talking a long time ago.
Sure.
So it was it was in its infancy, really. It wasn't really, the same sort of technology as it is now. You know, we were making recordings. I think we were using ADATs, actually. Was it ADATs or DA88s to get 8-channel counts? And we sort of synced just to be able to get enough. So it was back in the day when DAWs only had sort of 4 or even 8 channels of audio. So and even then they'd crash halfway through. So
the CPU couldn't handle it.
Yeah, exactly. And there was various different arrays and the way we would organize the speakers and the phase alignments. It was really quite basic in comparison.
Cumbersome, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, we wasn't at the time. It wasn't something I was really that. I mean, I got really into it, but it wasn't really something I could see a way forward. Because all I could see it being useful was potentially, you know, film, Eminem film sort of compositions. But it's strange to think I was learning those techniques over 25 years ago, and now I'm sort of in the middle of all this, doing this now. So somewhere along the line, I must have been following some sort of some pathway that I didn't know about. It's very serendipitous, but yeah,
that's funny.
Yeah, absolutely.
But is it theoretically possible to incorporate, just from what you know of ambisonics and Atmos, is it possible to incorporate those type of soundtracks within an Atmos mix?
I don't see why
theoretically.
Not. Theoretically, I would say so. Yes. Yeah. Whether it would actually benefit you or not, I don't know. But I'm sure it's technically possible. Yes.
Gotcha. You know, and the only reason why I bring that up is it's, you know, very unique ability of directionality, which you can achieve obviously with Atmos, but you know, wearing those VR headsets and stuff and experiencing an ambisonic soundtrack is pretty intense and pretty precise.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, so I was just curious if there was a way to integrate the two, since you had some background on that. But anyway, let's tie this back to what you were talking about with the Who, Quadrophenia, Atmos. Yeah, man, fucking rock and roll, man.
Oh yeah, I mean, interestingly, we were talking earlier about this, but interestingly, piecing it all back together again, Quadrophenia was insanely complicated. As I say, how they did it back in the day, it was just a feat of absolute genius. I mean, the album itself is incredible, but how they recorded that was just so ahead of its time. It was insane.
So how did you kind of handle that with the Atmos thing? And I know I'm opening up a huge box here by asking you that. So how did it carry over into the Atmos world, so to speak?
Yeah. I mean, the main thing to consider with it is the album is pretty much continuous. Obviously, there are some gaps in there, but not very many. So a lot of the songs segue from song to song. So in order to do that, that was quite a complicated sort of because it's such a massive session. Album, each song is such a huge session that we had to sort of find some sort of contingency where we could mix the whole album in one session, which was which was really quite complicated. And then obviously once we got the whole record mixed and transferred to an ADM, we then edit the whole record apart using the album assembler. That was the only way we could do it to get the segues to work perfect.
Yeah, the album assembler. But how did you so if with one song going into another, were you kind of doing very fixed positions on the drums, very fixed positions on the guitars? Like were you predominantly using beds or adding objects for the effects? What's the approach there? Or is it too proprietary?
All of that. All of that. It was because there was, there's only a fixed amount of objects you've got there, and we were mixing within beds. We were mixing within using all the objects. It was an enormous session, and it took such a long time to get it transferred across because it kept crashing.
Well, because
it was just putting the computer under so much strain to get it to do what I was trying to get it to do, essentially. But yeah, that was the only way to do it, because obviously I didn't want to compromise. Or there's a few things would mix down to sort of stereo mix stems, and then I would then mix them within the in the session, either into a bed or into a object or into an object effect. But yeah, I mean, it was just sort of round robin parts and just trying to get it all to fit and all to work in one enormous session, essentially. That was as far as I'm aware, that's the only way we could have done it at the time, and it worked in the end. So
So did just talking about you're referencing special effects and stuff that they did. Were you being faithful to the special effects in regard to, well, if they just have it going left to right, the effects, did you do that, or did you do it differently in the immersive world and kind of go, well, look, we can get that special effect and kind of put it up in the heights, put it around, and so on? Did you take those liberties?
I mean, with regards to movement within Atmos, I'm not really a big fan of that sort of stuff.
Really?
Yeah, if it's a cool moment and you think, yeah, that would work, that would be cool. But other than that, I don't do a lot of movement in the mixes. It just doesn't seem to need it, in my opinion. That's just my opinion. But I think the movement is more of a sort of bells and whistles thing. When I first got introduced to Atmos and I went through to one of these playback demonstrations, as we've all been to, and we've all heard Elton John and Rocket Man, which that was cool, but it's like, that's not what I was interested in. I think it was a Beatles number, and there was zero movement on it, and it was just the detail in the hi-hat and the drums that I could hear, and it was the height that I was like, this is really something else. It offers so much more than any other format I've heard before, and it's not about whether you can fly something around your head or that's just gimmicky, but to get the detail in sound that Atmos can give you, it's just something else, and that's what really grabbed me when I went to listen to it.
So when you hear Pete's guitar, it's like it's always there, like a fixed spot. Well, obviously he's doing layered guitars and stuff like that. I get that, but
yeah. I mean, in this particular instance, obviously, I'm following exactly where the instruments were placed in the original stereo, but then obviously you need to immerse yourself, so you need to put instruments within the space. So I will use heights occasionally, but I generally use the heights for sort of less detailed instruments, sort of more, or even and reverbs. What I like to do with the rear speakers, and I like to create mini sort of sub mixers. So when you can actually switch the speakers off, and what you're hearing in the back speakers is kind of almost like a coherent mix of what's going on as well. So you can kind of hear, you'll have like a guitar going with one of the vocals, and it sounds quite cool on its own. So it's like an added bonus sort of thing, to the mix, which harks back to the idea of how the quad mixers in the 70s used to sound, which I'm getting really into at the moment. I'm kind of using that as a reference to how I'm mixing my newer work that I'm involved with, and one of which being, if I can mention it is I've just remixed Jailbreak and Johnny the Fox with Scott Gorham from Thin Lizzy.
Oh wow!
And that that's an official exclusive. It's not been released yet.
Hopefully no porn pops up right now, so.
But yeah, that
Sorry,
was,
I had to mention it again.
that was a perfect example of you've got the big harmony guitar solos. I've got those literally sat in quad, and you've got the two bass, but you've got the bass in the front, the bass in the rear, and then the drums sort of hugging around you, and it just sounds incredible. It's just an experience. Like I say, you can switch the front speakers off and just listen to the back speakers, and you've almost got another mix to listen to. It's just a really incredible technique of getting a super immersive mix, really.
So in regard to reverbs and so on, and it was really interesting what you mentioned. Like, I actually, when I get a project that requires forensics, so to speak, I actually research who the engineer was, the producer was, the actual studio they did it in, and at that time, how they typically did things and so on.
Yeah.
Got a twofold question for you. One, have in any of those projects, they played a supervisory role? Like, in other words, assuming the guy was still alive. He's not a dead man walking, but where he would assist you from a supervisor. He's like, look, this is kind of the reverbs that we were using on the drums, for instance, and so on. That would point you using a convoluted reverb or finding the actual unit itself.
Not really, no. Essentially, how it's worked is I've been given the project. I've gone through all the anorak stuff that I like to do, and then get it to a stage where, obviously, I still create the mix in stereo to start with to make sure it's all sounding as comparable to the original as possible, and that I will then either send to the artist or the engineer to listen to make any comments, or they'll come here and have a listen as well, and then we'll make decisions and changes. Obviously,
so there obviously is that involvement from time to time, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they come into my studio quite frequently and just sit in and just make changes and make suggestions. But no one's really sort of questioned what I've used so far. But as I say, I do try and keep to the provenance of the recording as closely as possible.
Going back to Quadrophenia, the drums.
Yes.
How did you handle the drums? All objects, beds and objects. How did you kind of like lay it out?
Well, the vast majority of the drums on Quadrophenia were recorded 2 kick drums, 2 overheads, and that was it. The occasional song would have 1 or 2 additional mics, but mostly it was down to not very many drum mics. And when you put those mics up together, it sounds like Keith. So that's all you need.
Wow.
They recorded him as an instrument essentially, which is what you should do with drums, in my opinion. But you don't really need to.
No mic on the snare.
Not that I recall. Not so. As I said, there are a few recordings that did, and a few recordings that didn't. I mean, it's difficult to be absolutely sure now, because it was about 8 months ago when I did it. But,
sure. Now with the drums, with Keith Moon's drums, are you really pushing the height on those overheads?
Yeah,
elevating them.
Not massively. Just I bring them out a certain percentage and then just up a certain percentage, but I kind of don't like to bring it too far, because it can sort of get in the way of the vocals sometimes. So I like to put some of the lead vocal in the heights as well, which adds to a bit more sort of
fullness and so on. And did you say double kicks?
Yeah.
2 kick drums?
Yeah.
So wow. So you spaced them out like as if it's spaced out on a stage?
Absolutely, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's why.
And obviously, a lot of songs that the bass is panned over to some way to the left as well, is what you should find as well, which is kind of. But that's just the who,
Gotcha. Any separate reverb tracks, or were reverbs printed right on the takes?
I think the only reverb print was Love Rain, and that was the I think the plate was printed. that was it, basically. Nothing else.
Wow.
Everything else was recreated. But you know, back in those days, that the effects were pretty straightforward. You only had a handful of effects to choose from. You know, you've got a plate, a slap. You know, sometimes you put a tape machine on the send or the return of the plate just to get a slightly different effect with the reverb. But you know, various little techniques like that you get. You might get a something like a Cooper time cube in there, maybe, or a Binson. I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of trying to think back to what was actually on the notes now, but yeah, it was kind of more straightforward then. You know, you get mixes from albums in the 80s and the 90s, and they're way more convoluted to figure out what they were doing, because obviously you've gone beyond 8, 16, 20, and you're into 24 track territories, and you've got all your different reverbs and delays that are then available. So it's and the digital reverbs and digital delays come in, then there's so much gear that it's difficult trying to figure out exactly what they did. But
yeah, that's one hell of a challenge.
Yeah, so the earlier stuff, the 70s stuff, is actually relatively straightforward in comparison, but obviously the record Quadrophenia is just an absolute, you know, massive
It's a beast
album. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a beast.
Yeah.
So just getting back to the drums for a second, did you keep them in the same position in the Atmos field, immersive field, going from one tune into the next, or did you still, based on your discretion, move them as needed?
No, it's the drums stayed pretty much anchored to where they were, you know, where they are or were in the stereo.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Which I would think obviously makes perfect sense, going from one tune in another, because were you going for that feel like they were on a stage doing Quadrophenia live? Is that?
No, it was just basically listening to what was on the record and putting that back together again, essentially.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But yeah, as I say, going back to mixing records from the 70s, it's pretty. Robin Trower, Bridge of Sighs. I mean, that was a different record completely, and it's quite funny because I've done Quadrophenia, Thin Lizzy, Vagabonds, and Bridge of Sighs, and all three records are 1973, I think 72, 73, and all very different ways and ways of recording and mixing, and very different approaches from how it was done. So, but it's all within the same year of release, which is quite crazy. But and all rock, obviously, as well. But yeah, the Bridge of Sighs stuff, again, same sort of thing. Yeah, pretty straightforward to get the mix together, but some of the intricate sort of fader moves were pretty tricky to match, and some of the guitar effects on Robin's guitar was you know, really quite difficult to figure out. But once it's one of those things where you just sit there for days just scratching your head thinking, what is he doing here? And then it just clicks, and it's like, oh, thank goodness for that.
I'm going to give you a contrarian view here. And it's from a previous seminar, you know, and I know you're doing like heritage artists here and stuff like that. And there's probably certain expectations that the record label has as well as the artists have when you take it from a stereo version into an Atmos version. But, you know, one of the things that when we were talking with Ryan Oliate and Michael Romanowski is, you know, you know, if you're doing an Atmos mix, and this doesn't have to do with like old projects like The Who, you know, Thin Lizzy and so on, but just, you know, look, we're going to do an Atmos production. It's that, you know, there was this assumption, an assumption, not this is the way you do it, but there's an assumption that, oh, you do the stereo mix first. And then, you know, and then you do the immersive mix. And they were discussing that actually, you know, we kind of changed that, like, really when we approach a piece, we do, you know, the immersive mix first, because that we're dealing with 360, you know, and that's that version. And then we do basically a different stereo version because it's 2D. You're going from 3D to 2D. Different possibilities, different experiences. So my question for you was, in doing Quadrophenia, in doing Bridge of Sighs, was there an urge, or was there, you know, a license, poetic license, so to speak, that, you know what, you know, here's the stereo version. Yeah, man, I got Keith's drums pretty much together, but there's some other cool things going around that I want to exploit in the immersive world. Did you feel, or did you actually do, and did you have the license to do it, where like, yeah, I want to get these effects and I want to do them differently than what was on the original version?
Yeah, there's certain room for maneuver, definitely. And you know, if you listen to the Atmos version of Quadrophenia, listen to the Atmos version of any stuff I've done so far, it does have Atmos differences to the stereo, as in, you know, things are behind you for a start, they're not in the stereo field. But
yeah, sure.
But yeah, some certain things do have characteristics that wouldn't necessarily be possible in stereo. But I think the main reason why me in particular likes to work from stereo to start with is because it's it's obviously more familiar to work in stereo for a start, but also the technology of getting the glue of a track together is more straightforward to doing in the stereo field as it is in the Atmos field. So if I can get it together in the stereo field, then I can replicate that in the Atmos field, if that makes sense.
But don't you feel within the stereo field, and it's not for all things, but for some things, that, you know, your EQ curves tend to be a little bit more severe to get it to fit,
Of
you know,
course,
in that 2D field. And so when you move it out, you're like, wow, that just sounds a little gnarly to me. And, you know, maybe I can warm that up a bit because I have the sonic space.
Absolutely. No, that works all the time. Obviously, you're taking frequencies out of instruments to jam them into two speakers to get them to work together. So, you know, and things are fighting against each other. And yeah, you start moving things into the Atmos world, and it does have more room to breathe, and it's a different technique of mixing. But it depends on what you're mixing as well, as to, you know, if it's a real full-on rock track, you need that to gel together and keep cohesive as a rock track, because you find it can fall apart very quickly once you start moving it into the Atmos field.
Yeah.
But there are ways and techniques to prevent that and keep the energy in there as well. But just from my way of working, my workflow in particular, I prefer to start in the stereo and then move out, essentially.
And on that note, and I know you get into a fine line here because you want to be faithful to the original stereo mixes, for example, The Who, Quadrophenia, and others. But when you move those tracks out, decades old tracks, I might add, you know, where the engineer at that time is doing the same thing we do, is sometimes we're jamming things in to cut. Did you walk that fine line where kind of like, hey, there's Pete's guitar and in the Atmos field, and that you kind of need to warm it up a bit, you know, like, you know, add certain frequencies, remove certain frequencies because they were so aggressively EQ'd at the time they were done in stereo?
No, I mean the track to the multi-track's pretty flat, so you're kind of all right.
Oh, so they didn't print, really?
No. I mean,
really?
they might, you know, they're not printed any of the EQs they mixed with. They're not mixed to tape with those EQs.
Okay.
So it's a stage before that when they mix the stereo for it.
Well, yeah, no, I understand that, but there's engineers that print what they, you know, what they record. You know?
Yeah. I didn't come across any or much of that, really.
So you had to redo the whole EQ curves and everything. Wow.
Absolutely, yeah. No shadow of a day. But yeah, it's just figuring it out with, you know, using ears. I mean, I like to use. People are going to freak out, but I do a lot of my forensic work on headphones to start with, because you hear the detail much closer when you're figuring it out, and obviously swapping them backwards and forwards between the room and the headphones, just getting it really sort of tight, essentially, to make sure it's precise. Because things jump out in the room, things jump out in the headphones, but the initial forensic side of things, it's got to be done in the headphones to really get down into the nitty-gritty of it, essentially.
And on that note, let's touch on that point that I mentioned in the introductory notes. You kind of personalize your, what is it, HRTF, you know, and so on. So since you brought it up.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the binaural technology.
So why don't you give us a little insight, like what you did to kind of optimize the binaural experience for you to do this kind of forensic stuff?
Well, no, I mean, This is mixing. This is not necessarily for the forensic side of things. This is for the binaural mixers within Atmos. But essentially, when I first started doing Atmos, I really struggled with the binaural hearing. I couldn't get my head around it. And I think you mentioned in a previous seminar where you struggle with objects behind you. You felt that you had to turn them up in order.
I had to turn them up, and then I listened to it on a live monitor system, and the rears are way too loud.
Yeah, that's exactly. It just didn't feel right to me. And I kept talking to the guys at Dolby saying this is not working for me. I can't get my head around this. It's just not from it. I can't get my head around. I can't get my head around the Atmos. And this beta piece of software came out where you could personalize your HRTF. Because essentially, I mean, I don't know much about binaural because it's a pretty deep science.
Yeah.
I've not really got
psychoacoustics and shit like that.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. But essentially, as far as I'm aware, it's based on the old dummy head technology. So it's essentially based on everyone having the same shaped head and the same shaped ears, which no one else does. Everyone is completely personal. Yeah, everyone's different essentially.
Mm-hmm.
What this app did, it took a 360 scan of your shoulders, your neck, your head, and essentially built a profile for the listening purposes, which that you can then load into the renderer as your own person.
And what is this app?
I honestly can't remember the name of it. I'll dig it out and I'll send you a link to it so you can put it on the site.
Yeah, please, because I know the people out there would love to dig into it. You know,
absolutely. It was on there's a site called Production Expert, and it was on there about a year or so ago. But yeah, that as soon as I did that, it made such a massive difference for me. And then I was away then, you know, because it was when I was hearing the three options of, you know, near, mid, far. I was just hearing reverb, and it's like, this just sounds ridiculous. As soon as I got the personal head, the HRTF set up, it was then, okay, it's not reverb, it's actually distance. I get it now, and I can hear it. It's working for me. But yeah, so it's definitely recommended to do that. I would definitely.
Yeah, if you could send me that link, and then I'll share it, because when I was first getting into Atmos, I was really just at first just using headphones, and then an Atmos facility is about a half an hour from me. I would reference my mixes, and in the beginning I was like, oh man, like this is sad. I mean, I had to go into the studio, like make all these changes and stuff, and I'm like, the rears are like way too loud, you know what I mean? But I have improved it, a bit, and my headphones are now calibrated and stuff. But I would be really interested in testing that out, that app, because it seems like, and I know we've spoken before, and you said that you've been pleased with the results.
Yeah, it just translates now. So I know.
Do you feel confident enough on that note? Do you feel confident enough that you could actually mix purely on the headphones, or it's like, nah, man, I still need to reference it on my speakers?
I wouldn't be comfortable. No, I'd have to reference on speakers. It's a different experience.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had to, and I was held at gunpoint, then yeah, obviously I could, because I know what works and what doesn't work. But I would still think, maybe something I'd desperately need to hear in a room, essentially. Because I mean, let's face it. I mean, the binaural side of it is, in my opinion, is the entry level, isn't it? Really, it's the thing other formats didn't have. The other surround formats didn't have. It's the way in for everyone, essentially. You don't have to.
Well, what are people listening to? They're on headphones.
Exactly. You don't have to have a room.
AirPods and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. You whereas before you got to 5.1, you had to have a room. You had to have a set of speakers, a decent playback system, and then the knowledge of how to calibrate a system and set it up properly. There's a lot of people still don't know how to do that. But
yeah, that's true. Listen, on that note, pause. Chip, are you there, buddy?
Chip? Yes, Mark, I am. We are getting some questions. There's one hand.
Yeah, so
you want to entertain it?
Yeah, let's kind of roll. And I don't know if Natalia is still there, or Marcela, but if we can fit them in without getting hacked again, hopefully. But yeah, you could bring them up if they have any questions, and shoot some questions to Richard from the chat room.
Hi, how are you?
Hello.
Hello. I'm Paulo from Chile. Sorry if my English isn't good, but I have a question. To what extent is it important to respect the sound of the stereo mix, assuming an Atmos mix is a new sound experience?
Okay, so you have to. So can you mute the mic? Is that right? I'm hearing the.
It's
Yeah,
muted.
Okay, so obviously you have to use the stereo as a reference, and it is a new experience, but you kind of got to where we are at the moment with the transition from stereo to Atmos. We're still sort of tied to stereo. I think once we go beyond that point and everyone understands the format, we can then get into some real creative stuff. But at the moment, I think we still have to adhere to how things sound in stereo and kind of work with that soundstage. You'll notice in my newer mixes, I'm starting to break away from that considerably, because you know, I've figured out ways of keeping that cohesion within that you'll get from a stereo mix and put it into the, you know, the surround environment. But as I say, to start with, it was a different sort of experience, and a lot of people didn't quite understand how it was supposed to sound. So if it's such a drastic change from the stereo, then it sometimes didn't go over too well with the consumers. It seemed like a completely different version or a different mix to the stereo, and didn't necessarily sit too well with a lot of people. So it's just baby steps essentially. I think give it a couple of years, and I think we're going to be in some seriously different territory. I mean, the Peter Gabriel album, for example, that's recently come out, that's made giant strides in what we're going to be doing with Atmos. You know, releasing various versions of the album. You know, the one that adheres to the stereo, and then the creative versions. That's something that I'm really interested in.
Where the Atmos mix is a completely different version of the two.
Yeah, so you get the version that adheres to the stereo version. So you got the Atmos version that sticks to the stereo, and then you got the Atmos version that is based on the original song, but it's something really different,
completely different. Yeah, I mean, and I'm a bit, and just briefly, you know, I'm a big proponent of that, you know, and I understand, you know, like, look, the audience are familiar with a certain version of Love Reign Over Me, you know what I mean? So when they hear the Atmos mix, you kind of have to be, I would think, faithful to that. But if it's a new composition, I kind of look at it, look, here's the stereo mix. This is one way to do it, 2D version, and here's my 3D, which may be completely different and for better.
Absolutely, and I agree with that. Absolutely, no problem whatsoever. Yeah.
Like two different versions, you know, why make it like the other? Exploit the 360, you know,
without a shadow of a doubt.
Chip, is there another question there?
Mark, I shut down the chat. I can open it up again. We were getting sort of, you know, inappropriate comments there too. So I just thought, what, you know,
well, this is one for the ages.
I would say, anybody that's currently in the meeting, why don't you just raise a hand if you'd like to speak, and we'll
all right, we'll do it that way.
We'll do it that way.
All right, that's fine. That's fine. Any comments, people? Any questions for Richard? Okay, so if anybody does have a question, raise your hand, and that's the way we'll do it. But Richard, at this time, just give us a brief little thing. What's behind you there? Is that your home computer?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, my room is 714 Focal. And I also have a set of TPI stereo reference as well. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with TPI monitors, but absolutely stunning monitors. They're a little company up in Leicestershire. They've got engineers from Neve and ATC building incredible piece of equipment. They're just so detailed. It's beautiful speakers. And if Giles is listening, I'm considering installing them in my room as an Atmos system, but yeah, they're pretty expensive, so it's going to be a hell of an investment if and when I get around to it. But he would have to build them for me bespoke, essentially. But they're incredible speakers.
Sweet.
Yeah.
So you said 7.1.4. So are all of them, but for that sub you told me earlier about, they all focal?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Gotcha.
The ceiling monitors are I don't know if you, well,
You don't need to move it. It's cool. It's cool. You don't need
the ceiling monitors are soffit mounted, so they're actually in the ceiling. So that you literally just there's literally a square grill that's magnetized to the ceiling, so you can't even see the heights. And yeah, it's focals all around essentially.
Are you all Pro Tools or Cubase or Nuendo?
Yeah, I know how to work all the AWs, but I'm most comfortable with Pro Tools just through familiarity, really.
Gotcha. And are you running the renderer on a separate machine, or is it kind of using the version that's where the renderer is now all built in?
Oh no, I'm running the render on the same machine. However, it's not the one built into Pro Tools. I'm not
Gotcha.
I'm not brave enough to go into that one just yet.
Well,
I think it's a few more versions of Pro Tools before I'll even consider. I like to run behind the curve. I don't like to be on this. I like to run with what's working essentially.
Gotcha. What about the people that have, like Brad Wood, last seminar he did, he has a 9.1.4. He likes those extra 2 speakers to spread the left and right a little wider. Do you concur with that, or or do you like it more like 7.1.4? I mean, is there any difference to you?
No, I mean, I would love to have a bigger system. It's just I'm limited by the size of my room essentially. Yeah. So it's not the there's no real, the only factor in the choice is the fact that I've got a smaller room.
Marc, Pablo would like to ask a follow-up question.
Okay.
Pablo, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hello?
Pablo? Is he going to ask again?
Okay, I'm here.
Hello.
Hello, Richard. I'm really interested in to know how your point of view to spatialize your mixes. I'm used to use fix some listener point of view, and through the mix try not to change that point of view. But if you have, for example, salsa mix, too many instruments, too many information, how do you spatialize that? How do you locate that mix?
So you can meet yourself. Myself. So a mix with lots of instrumentation from the listener's perspective. I mean, it's just essentially creating space within the room, but keeping it cohesive as well. Again, it's just down to techniques that you know from stereo mixing, how to get things to work together. Essentially, a good technique to keep things gelled together is to side chain the compressor across all the objects. I don't think that's something that you've come across before. That sort of keeps things gelled together quite a lot. But yeah, I mean, generally, if something works within the space and it's not jumping out at you, then unless it's obviously a compositional, intentional thing to do, but if it's not jumping out and it's working within the whole sort of gel of the track, then there's no reason why it shouldn't work wherever you put it, really. If that answers your question, I hope. I can't hear you now.
Okay, Natalia, you can let her open up. Chip, do you see her? Chip, do you hear me?
Yes, I did hear you, Marc. I'm just
Natalia, it says Natalia's iPhone 3.
Yep. Where did she go? There we are. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hello.
Hey, Natalia, how you doing? Richard can hear you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, guys. This has been very, very nice to hear and very inspiring for sure. I wanted to actually ask you something, Richard. What have been some things that you consider a little risky or crazy or different in some of your mixes that you've done? And have they worked, or did you like ended up like taking them out because they were too much or something? I just want to know a little bit about those things that maybe are a little different from what we actually do on stereo mixes.
Yeah. Well, as I say, I think the most crazy thing I've ever done on a mix is when is going back to the 5.1 of Tommy, when Bob and I put the drums in the rear left speaker. So
right.
that was pretty insane. But as I say, to start with, it was kind of off-putting. But as soon as you got used to it, you kind of felt like your head got into how it worked, and after a while, you just kind of work. So I guess I think it's just keep playing it, and eventually you get used to it.
Right.
The old axiom, use your ears, right? You know.
Yeah. I mean, there are certain things that I've done. You know, for example, you put a vocal somewhere, and it just jumps out somewhat and makes it distracting from the mix. Therefore, you know it's not right. You need to put it somewhere else in the room for it to work within the track, which is going back to what Pablo was saying. It's got to work within the song. You know, whether it's an Atmos mix or a stereo mix, it's got to work within the context of the track and how it was composed. You can't just have parts just suddenly appearing from nowhere and then going back into the fold, really.
Definitely. And because I also think that you're mentioning one of the things that I think are the most challenging whenever mixing in general, and it's the objectivity. When you start listening over and over and over, and you lose, like the objectivity of the first time you're listening to it. It's complicated. So many times I find myself doing things that I think they're working very well because I've been listening to them many times, and then I would come back the next day and be like, oh my God, this is too crazy. I'm gonna have to go back and change everything. You know what I mean?
I think every engineer in the world's all experienced that, really. You always end up making crazy changes at the end of the day when you're tired. then end up having to do the next morning. But now I've got a routine that I know that works. I mean, I don't work late nights. I actually work very early mornings because I'm much more sharp on a morning. So I'll start work at sort of 5-6 a.m. and I'll work through till about 5-6 p.m. And by that point, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, I'm not making any drastic changes to anything.
Fatigue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's fatigue. Yeah. That kicks in.
You just know to step away. You just like leave it till tomorrow, come back, fresh ears, away you go again.
Yeah.
Mark, we have another question from Paul.
Okay, yep. Bring Paul in.
Okay, I'm asking him to unmute.
Hi, everybody. Lovely meeting. Richard, Marc, thanks very much for being incredible hosts through that muck that we all had to endure. Natalia's question is quite, I think, on point here. And so, Richard, obviously you've got a lot of wisdom as a mix engineer here, and I'm just wondering if you could explain or discuss when you're working in 7.14 and you're making a decision about perspective and relational balance between instruments, objects, et cetera, as Natalia was pointing out. Do you check, like, you'll take your 7.1.4 and do a quick check in 5.1, do a check in stereo, maybe do a check in mono, and just kind of have a perceptual idea of the energy you're placing on an object in Atmos and how that is then folding down to mono or stereo. I'm just wondering if that's part of your process.
Absolutely, yeah. I check everything. You have to make sure it's going to work across the formats. I mean, obviously the fold down to stereo is not going to be quite as good as a proper stereo mix, but we'll get there eventually, I think. But yeah, I do. It's a good way of testing to fold it down. I mean, because I remember before we figured out the trim and down mix functions, I used to be checking the stereo and always have to figure out why the lead vocal was folding down the stereo too loud. And eventually we discovered that we had to adjust the settings within the renderer to compensate for that. But yeah, it's always worth checking on every single format that you can get it on, really.
Paul brings up an excellent point, and the key word being fold down. And I'm not saying it's all the time, but I'm just still skeptical of folding down a 7.1.4 or a 9.1.4 mix to a stereo mix. I mean, there's so many variables that get involved in bouncing it down to 2D, and I can just tell you from work that I've done where I've always had to do the stereo mix differently than using the fold down. It sounds convenient, you know, but it doesn't. Yeah, I've heard some people do it, and yeah, it seems to translate well, but on other, it's not some panacea that you can just do it on every type of mix. Some of them it works, but some of them it doesn't. And I heard
it is a good test to just fold it down and have a listen, because you sometimes find things jumping out and you think, oh,
yeah,
okay,
as a reference type of thing, I get that.
Absolutely, yeah.
But as a final stereo mix, I'm sorry, I'm not in that camp personally.
I don't think it's there yet. I mean, if it ever will get there. But yeah, I mean, you know, the dream is that everyone will be mixing Atmos and give everyone a fold down of the stereo. So it's, but you know, I think we're all.
Well, wouldn't it be beautiful? It would save a lot of time, right? You know.
So at that point, rather than essentially we're not trying to make an Atmos version of stereo. You're making a stereo version of the Atmos. Yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah, I just, you know, more often than not, to me, I mean, again, what Paul was alluding to is like using it as just a reference, like, hey, how's it translating to stereo? That is resourceful, but some people have these assumptions, not all, just some that I've encountered, that they think they can just fold it down into that and hey, it's done. And you got to check your work, that's for sure. And anyone else, Chip?
We don't have, yes, Natalia is back. So Natalia,
right,
please unmute and go ahead.
Yep. Natalia, you there? All right.
Hi. Yes, here I am.
Good.
Can you hear me? Good. Awesome. I just have one question out of curiosity. Richard, how much do you use objects versus the bed? Is it something you think about, or is there any reason like why you would choose to use something as a bed, in the bed instead of objects, or just wondering about that, if you feel a difference, or do you think that it makes sense to use a lot of bed or a lot of the objects and that in general?
Yeah, I prefer to use the objects and keep the bed specifically for effects and reverb. I think it's Steve Genowick that said that the bed doesn't translate so well on bigger systems. So you're mixing on a 714 system, then play it on a 914 system, and on the extra speakers it won't kind of translate the same. So and I've found the same sort of issue. So now I prefer to work with the objects as the main source of audio, and then use the bed as a reverb bed essentially. But that depends on what the project is. You know, sometimes you've got, you know, so and obviously sometimes things, you know, work differently in different situations. So it's always, you know, there's never really any hard and fast rules as to how anything's done. Really, you can't really. There's no real sort of one answer for all. It's just going to take a case by case project, really.
Yeah, amazing. I was just asking because like when I first started mixing on Atmos, I was like using, you know, mainly the bed and just a few things on objects. But lately I've been changing a lot to that, what you're saying, Richard, as well, and just having almost everything on objects and just a few things on the bed, especially effects or different things like that. So I just was wondering about the tickets.
Your objects are defined coordinates, aren't they? Whereas as opposed to your bed, it changes on the size of the system. So
perfect point.
Yeah,
you kind of fall victim to that.
Yeah,
you really do. Excellent point.
I think it was
awesome.
I think it was I did the Doolittle by the Pixies, and me and the guy who was working on it, we took it to Dolby to have a listen, and that was a 914 system. that was the first time I encountered that, you know. So we eventually put it all back into objects and stuck with the bed as
Right.
effect. So that was something that I encountered personally. And then I heard Steve Genuit mention it. I was like, yeah, I know exactly what you mean there with that. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah.
Follow up with you, Richard. Vocals, you know, we discussed this before. It's an issue from time to time. Phantom center, put the main vocal dead center, a little bit into left and right. How do you stand on that position?
Left, center, right vocal pretty much across all three.
Really? Equally?
No. I like to put probably about 25% into the center. And then, but then the rest in left and right, with the
wow. Okay.
Well.
Interesting.
And some height to it as well. Yeah,
that's interesting, and it's still an ongoing debate.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I like to compare when I do the playbacks at Dolby HQ. It's a large theatre, so obviously you kind of figure out what works and what doesn't work when you go into that space.
Yeah.
I've kind of used that as a guide as to how I mix things. Obviously, you've got to mix things for in the room, but how do you sort of compromise that for a larger system of that caliber? Yeah, so that's the way I've been going with it so far, and it kind of seems to translate pretty well.
All right, because the big argument is that you kind of, if you do the phantom center thing, nothing in the center, just left and right, you kind of lose focus. Like there's Roger Daltrey, like there, he's not there.
And there's I think someone in your previous podcast mentioned something about the phantom center between the other sets of speakers, and I like to work with that aspect of
yeah, well, that's cool, that's different.
Yeah, but no, I definitely have to feed something into the center speaker without a shadow of a doubt. That's probably from my old 5.1 days though.
Yes. Chip, anybody else?
Yeah, we have a couple more here. Hey, Tom, why don't you go ahead, buddy?
Thank you. Hey, Richard and Marc. Richard, you just said when you answered Natalia's question that you use the reverbs on the bed. How do you maintain or get like the definition on the top speakers, since the bed falls down the reverb from 0.4 to the 0.2, and the top left front and rear speakers play like the same, so it isn't like as defined as using like a bed object, an object bed. So how do you get along with that?
Well, I use a combination of both. I build an object bed with reverbs within the objects, and then I also use 712 reverbs into the two. So that covers all aspects of fold down.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you.
Simple enough.
Okay, we have another question from AC. Please unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, hey AC, how are you?
All right, I'm glad that you guys had the patience to deal with this amateur earlier on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, man.
I've been really enjoying these calls. The question that I have is about with the immersive, with the Dolby Atmos. Did you outfit your space yourself, or you had somebody come in and set you up that way? And do you find yourself with more work being a Dolby Atmos studio?
Okay, so that's quite a long answer. So I built the room. I put the speakers in. I had a guy come and help me who was a carpenter to obviously fit the soffit mounted speakers, go to cut holes in the roof to get it in there. And he helped me with the cabling and stuff. But in general, I fitted it all out. And then Dolby came and tested the room, because obviously I applied for accreditation. I was one of the first studios in the UK to be accredited as a Dolby Atmos music studio, because it's just after the pandemic that it all happened. And they came and they measured the room and decided that it was within tolerance. Therefore, I got accredited. So There you go. As for work, I was, one of the first set up, and it was a bit of a wild west for a while. It was more people who could do it as opposed to were capable of doing it were working. But obviously, the more the format got recognized as to what is a good mix and what is a bad mix, that kind of evened itself out. But yeah, there was a lot of work to start with, but then it kind of petered out to a gradual sort of ticking over of work all the time. And I don't know how it would, if you're considering setting up now, I don't know how that would work. I couldn't advise that one way or the other, but no, I'm pretty much established in this now. So yeah, it seems to be ticking over nicely.
Yeah. And just on that note, Richard, soundproofing. I mean, I see that thing above your monitor there is bass trap.
Yeah.
Did you do a lot of was it after Dolby checked your room out, or was it before Dolby and they checked it out and were like, hey, this is working out? I mean, any insight on that?
And I mean, I've built a couple of rooms before, so I kind of know the principles of what to do and what not to do. And so, they came, they measured it, and they were happy. So
good. All right, cool. That's cool. Chip, anybody else?
Well, AC still has his hand up. Do you have a follow-up question?
Oh yeah, go ahead. Yep. Let him unmute, AC.
No, I don't. I'm sorry. Let me take that off.
All right. All right. Anybody else other than AC there, Chip?
Yeah. Hey, Tom is back for a follow-up.
Okay.
Hey guys, actually, I don't have a question. I don't want to be maybe like inappropriate. About the guy at the beginning of the call, Marc. I think that his camera was on when the meeting started. So if you guys recorded, maybe you could like identify
okay,
space or anything, so it doesn't.
Yeah, we're gonna have to do some research here, and it's just a complete bummer. And Richard, I apologize to you as many others. Just the complete disturbance, it would throw anybody off. But I appreciate you telling me that, Tom. And we'll
thank you guys.
We'll
thank you guys for doing this.
Yeah, not a problem, man.
Okay, we have another question from Roland.
First of all, hello for everybody. Thank you, Marc, and thank you, Richard, for having me. My name is Bela Barabash from Hungary. It's a different name because this is the studio owner name on this Zoom. My name is Bela, or BC, from Budapest. Thank you. It's absolute perfect for me. Is all the information, all your kind. Yes, and I have a very short two questions. First is, Richard, you use a size for the object or not? If you use, what is your opinion, or whole percent is good enough or not good enough, or just this is the first one? You understand my English? Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Thank you.
Okay, so size, no, I don't use size.
Right.
I think the issue has been fixed in the renderer with size now, but essentially it didn't translate too well, so I've just avoided using it from the beginning.
I found it to be too aggressive. Like, like just going a factor of 10. It just in volume and space, it was.
Yeah, it made it louder in the headphones, which is not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. You just want
to
present in more areas. I'm the same way. I don't use it often at all.
No, I think it's been addressed in the most recent version of the renderer, so it translates a little bit better. But even so, I've managed that this far. I don't think it's going to be something I'll look into in a hurry.
Okay, just a couple more questions, and we got to wrap up. I see Andrew there, Chip.
Yeah, I'm just going back to maybe a follow-up here real quick.
Oh, okay, sure, fine, that's fine.
Oh, thank you. Just a short second question. If you have a talent or some partner who work with you, when finish the mix, the quality check or the acceptance is what way you use. You send out a binaural mix or a MP4, or the talent goes to your place and check the mix there at your studio. What is way you use, or what is you believe is work better for you?
I obviously I always prefer to get people in the studio because it sounds much better.
Right. Okay.
But I will always send both the binaural and the MP4, and obviously the instructions on how to use it. Also, another thing that's worth doing, which I've found success with, is to level match the stereo as well and send that out, because that's always something that irks people. Is you send the Atmos mix is much quieter than a stereo mix, and
Absolutely.
obviously, to the ear, louder is always better. So I'll level adjust the stereo to the Atmos, so that when they compare the binaural to the stereo or the MP4, it's at the same level. Therefore, they can hear what it's doing without being distracted by the difference of a normal stereo mix. If that's any help.
Thank you very much. Absolutely same way what I use always. Thank you. Just it was a question. Interesting. How do you think about this? Thank you very much. I appreciate all the things. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for participating.
We've got another question from Andrew. New question.
Okay.
Waiting for him to unmute.
There we go. Couldn't unmute. Richard, I had a question. Since you said you don't use size, how are you feeding the front wall, if you're using stereo vocals, into the center channel? Are you just busing it into some sort of center object and feeding it that way, or how are you doing that?
Yes, essentially busing into a center object, and obviously bringing the vocals slightly in from the outside edges.
Okay, so not hard left, hard right, but bring it in a touch, and that'll feed into the center there.
Yeah. And on other occasions, I will feed stuff into a center object. Yeah. Again, different projects, different approaches.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
One more, maybe. Fogel, please go ahead.
Hi. Will you guys be sharing that after you edit out the porn? Will you be sharing on social media?
Yeah, don't worry. And I apologize. We have to research what happened. But go ahead. Yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay, good. Because there's a lot of great stuff in there. And I would have put this in the chat, but you had to disable it. I had to jump in and out of things. But I wanted to tell you too that when your Zoom meeting starts, there's a security bar in the Zoom taskbar, and in that you can click that people can't rename themselves.
Good.
But I just thought I'd tell you that, and
thank you.
I really enjoyed this, despite that kid who couldn't, get on Reddit or whatever that was, and look forward to watching it again edited.
Yes.
Thank you.
I will get that edited, and I'll post that on our channel and distribute it accordingly. But thank you, Leslie. Just let's get Sam in here. Sam Downey.
Sam Downey.
Sam.
Hello. Good evening to you.
Hey, Sam. How are you? Great to finally
Thank
talk with you, my friend.
Yeah, lovely to talk to you. I've so to Mark, I've sent you some links. So for what Richard was talking about earlier was the Dolby personal HRTF.
That's the one. Yeah.
That can be found on Dolby's website, on the professional site, professional.dolby.com.
Yep. Great.
And you can sign up to it. It's in beta stage at the moment, and has been for the last 2-3 years, I think.
And is that the app that you're talking about, Richard?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Great.
Yeah, and it's really great. But every so often you do need to do a re-recording of your ear just to reset its settings, basically. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And so my question for Richard is, my first thing is Richard, I thank you for the invite which you gave me about a year ago to come and visit your studio, and I will do sometime this year. Since I'm UK based.
Yes.
And I'm now a mix engineer for verified by Universal Music Group.
Congrats.
So there's lots of things I'll be doing for lots of art, lots of mixes. But my question for Richard is, what plugins do you use? And also, so in the box recording, what plugins and or hardware do you like using?
I don't use hardware. If you're talking external, outboard. Plugins, well, obviously for Atmos, that is obviously for stereo and mixing and mastering, I use outboard. But plugins, the one I use the most, I think, Stratus 3D is very good. I've obviously got the Nugent Halo stuff, which is great. Obviously not for mixing the whole thing, but just for
I use Halo too. I use Halo.
Or depth on a particular part is good to mix the specific parts within a mix. What else do I use? I think obviously the Dolby Atmos album assembler is absolutely key to my workflow, but that's not really a plugin, is it really? But the limiter and the EQ that's on there is absolutely priceless, even though it's quite basic, but it just really does help a lot of the times. Yeah, other than that, it's just pretty much your stock sort of, basic stuff. I mean, I've got thousands of plugins, but they're the ones that Stratus is the one I use predominantly.
Richard, do you use any of the SSL plugins?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Incredible. Yeah, absolutely.
The E version or G version, or do you use them both?
The official SSL stuff, yeah, because it comes. I've got the desk, so it comes with it all. But
oh, sweet!
They're by far the best sounding SSL plugins that I've come across. It blows the versions out of the water. Even the UAD version, it's just incredible. But yeah, they're fantastic. I use the channel strips and the bus compressors all the time.
Yeah, that's cool. Sam, thank you so much for your question. So listen, people, we got to wrap up here. Richard, it's been really entertaining on a multitude of levels.
Yeah.
Richard, it probably exceeded your expectation.
Wait, I had no idea. Brilliant. Yeah.
It was a good thing you had a drink in hand, because at one point I needed one too.
Oh, you.
Chip, man, you are a total hero, brother. Man.
Well, we learn something every time, don't we? So that shit will never happen again.
Yeah, I mean, you were a hero in managing that, but I think everybody kept their cool, and we just kind of worked through it and so on. But brother, I owe you a round of drinks.
Well, I think I owe you one, actually. We'll both buy.
There you go. Fair enough. Anyway, so Richard, man, thank you so much for your time, man. And I will create an edited version, severely edited version, at least the first, I guess, 25% of the beginning there. I'll be chopping a lot of stuff out and then get that uploaded. So, my friend from across the pond, rock on.
Thank you, Richard. You're the best, brother.
All right. Thank you, man. Take care now.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.